Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 13. So, in Chapter 13, we'll be going over social psychology, which I think is probably the most fun chapter because I think that there's a lot of opportunities to kind of have an aha moment as an individual where maybe you gain a little bit more recognition about why you think the way you think, why you explain particular people's behaviors in a certain way, and then also understand some bigger topics, things like prejudice, discrimination, microaggressions. And so there's a lot in this chapter. And I just think that this is, again, more relatable than maybe some of the other chapters on the brain, the nervous system. All these chapters are important because they really do give you kind of a more holistic picture of the field of psychology. But this chapter in particular, kind of similar to the learning chapter, I think really gives you a better, gives you better insight into the way humans work. And gives you a perspective on how they work within a society. And so, as I mentioned in your welcome video, I promise to keep this PowerPoint and the associated videos shorter than normal because I do want to really encourage you all to vote this week. I'm hoping many of you voted early in some capacity, either through mail-in ballot or going in person early. That's what I decided to do. I felt safest going early because that way I could leave if I felt like there were too many people around because of COVID precautions. But I do think that this is probably the most appropriate chapter for the week that we are voting for our next president, our vice president, local representatives, our Senate and Congress people. So again, I promise to keep this shorter than I would typically because again, I love this chapter and I just think that it's so relevant to day-to-day life. So not to start this chapter on kind of a down note, but I kind of like to frame this chapter by starting from maybe some more of the negative parts, or maybe I'm going to use air quotes around the bad things or the horrible things that people do. And then we're going to shift gears to more kind of everyday things and then end again on more of a kind of a bad framing or negative framing in terms of why people do some horrible things. But all of these things are important to consider because I know many of you are interested in the field of psychology because of things like the Boston Marathon bombing, which you can see here, the Columbine High School shooting, and then, of course, September 11th, which were a series of terrorist attacks on our country. And I feel bad kind of starting this from such a kind of a dark side of mankind. But I think it's important to start here because I do know this is what brings a lot of you to the field of psychology. During office hours, I've talked to a lot of you about serial killers, mass murderers. And so this really leads to the question of why do people do these types of things? And so social psychology covers a lot of different topics. We talk about roles, attitudes, group conflicts, how our kind of internal dialogue impacts how we think and feel, the conclusions we come to of why people do things or don't do things, which ultimately kind of builds to more complex kind of systemic issues of discrimination and prejudice. And so again, I love that this chapter is the week that you're voting because I think it's so relevant, but I also kind of hate it because I do wish that I could lecture on this longer. But again, I promised to keep this short because I do want to give you a little bit of an abbreviated day, at least this week, because of Election Day. So just to kind of start, I think the textbook does a nice job of setting up this idea that there are a lot of social forces in our life. And I think that if there was one way to talk about psychology as maybe being limited from a social psychology perspective, I think sometimes psychology overemphasizes the individual. I think that 90% of the field of psychology looks at the biology of the individual, the genetics of the individual. We're very individual focused. And I think that that's important. But I do think that the social forces on the individual maybe get downplayed in the field of psychology. And so that's what social psychology contributes. It gives us more of a perspective on how the person operates within a society, within a family, within a community. And, I think, again, your textbook does a nice job of starting from this perspective that people matter to us. I'm thinking of, I know many of you from the first week discussion board, you watched The Umbrella Academy. Great show if you haven't seen it. It's on Netflix. And there's a character in there who's named Five, and he lives in this post-apocalyptic world, and he's by himself, and so he has a romantic partner, which is a mannequin. And so I love that kind of example because it highlights that we really do need relationships in our life. And even in situations where maybe there aren't other people around, like I'm thinking of Tom Hanks in Castaway. He has the volleyball, that he names Wilson, and he develops such a strong tie to that, that object, that when the object floats away, he's devastated. And so it really does highlight the importance of relationships and people. Part of that is because it creates structure. It regulates our life, right? And so we have norms, which are both explicit laws and implicit conventions, all things that kind of structure us and lead us to do certain things and not do other things. We have roles, we have social positions, we have, for example, gender roles of how we're supposed to dress, behave, behavior that's appropriate and inappropriate based on these kind of unspoken norms or regulations. We live within a culture, which is where we have values and beliefs and customs that are shared by most people within that community. And, one thing that's kind of, incredible about the United States is we have so many cultures represented, which sometimes can create clashes when there's differences in values and beliefs, and people are trying to navigate similar spaces, and there might be some conflicts there. And so, this is where we get to talk about some of the more influential studies in the field of psychology, Milgram's obedience studies, Zimbardo's prison study. Please read those descriptions thoroughly because these are very important experiments that helped us understand why people might do horrible things, why you might shock someone you've never met before. Someone that is screaming and saying it hurts and that they have a heart condition. Why, a random college student might take on the role of being a prison guard and in some ways kind of, abuse another individual or restrict their rights. These studies have helped us understand why people might make the decisions that they make. Things like looking back at Nazi Germany, looking at terrorists, going back to that question of why do people do the things that they do, particularly horrible things. But as I promised, I was going to shift to kind of more everyday things. And I love the attribution theory because it helps us understand why we come to certain conclusions. And so essentially it says that we are motivated to explain both our own behavior and other people's behavior by saying whether it is, because of the person's personality or kind of who they are, or because of the situation they're in. And so generally speaking, people have this fundamental attribution error because when they're explaining other people's behavior, they overestimate personality, underestimate situational factors. So think of when you are driving on the interstate and a car just blows you off the road going 100 miles an hour. Typically, we pause and think, what an asshole. Look at how dangerous he's driving. He's going to hurt someone. And so we're overestimating personality, underestimating situation. Whereas if you ever are in a situation where you have to drive fast, you might be thinking, well, I know this is dangerous, but I have to do it because I have to get to the hospital. Someone's hurt and I have to get there. Or I'm late for an important meeting, and if I'm not there on time, I'm going to lose my job, right? So we have these self-serving biases where we assume we're, good people, probably better than most people. Good things are going to happen to good people. So if I'm good things will come. That's the just world belief, right? We assume that when we make bad or risky or unsafe decisions, it's not us being a bad person, it's the situation. But with other people doing those types of things or making those decisions, we assume it's dispositional or inherent to their personality. So I love this kind of framing of how we explain certain people's behaviors versus our own, and we see this in everyday life. Think about this in your everyday life. I bet you'll see a lot of examples. So as I said, one of the things that social psychology as a subfield of psychology really contributes is this idea that individuals exist within social groups. And so there have been several studies done specifically on how the presence of other people or information from other people might change the decisions that the person makes. And so the most famous is probably Ash's conformity study, which, as you read, it's essentially where someone knows that people around them are making the wrong decision or picking the wrong answer, and yet because of conformity or this need to fit in, they essentially go along with the group. And so this also relates to groupthink, which has actually been identified as the cause of a lot of pretty bad decisions or also tragedies, depending on the particular situation you're looking at. So, like the Challenger explosion, which I think probably happened before most of you were alive. But several astronauts died because of that. A lot of people that have analyzed the decision to invade Iraq, which started a very long military presence in other countries, and many soldiers died, and also civilians. That has also been attributed to groupthink. And so essentially it's this understanding of when people are within groups, how does the presence of the group impact them? And so, other ways that we kind of more everyday might see examples would be the bystander effect or diffusion of responsibility, which is why, if you ever take a CPR class, one of the first things they tell you to do when you notice someone is having a medical event is that you point to a specific person and say, Sam, call 911. So rather than saying someone call 911, they've tailored that training to identify a specific person to call 911 because research shows people tend to just assume someone else will do it. De-individuation also explains why, again, once we're kind of blending in it within a group, we might make decisions that aren't necessarily reflective of us as a person. And so I think back to a few examples when I was in college, and we would play an in-state, or I'm sorry, it was actually an out-of-state rival. This out-of-state rival was known for burning couches. And so there were always these scenes of these college students carrying these couches and lighting them on fire. It always seemed so like barbaric and bizarre to me. But then, when I kind of got a better understanding of de-individuation in my general psych class, it's basically you just kind of blend into the group and just go along with what's happening, even if it's not necessarily reflective of you as a person. And so this brings us to this kind of us versus them mentality, which can actually lead to a lot of conflict. And so, through this class, we've mostly been talking about kind of an individual's personal identity, this sense of like them as an individual, their sense of self. Whereas we also have to acknowledge that people have social identities and multiple social identities. They might, identify as belonging to a particular racial group, particular religious group, social group. There's lots of different ways we can frame social identities. And people feel very motivated by their social identity, and this can actually create conflict. And your book reviews the Robbers Cave experiment, which shows basically even children in a situation where they're, assigned to a particular group at camp can become very cutthroat, very hostile towards other groups. And so when you think of it more as like a lifelong identity, we can start to understand why, again, there can be a very hostile relationship between particular social groups. And so again, to provide an example from my own life, I went to Virginia Tech for undergrad. And if any of you, are familiar with Virginia Tech, you know that they have an in-state rival, UVA. And so it is very much an us versus them mentality. I hate to admit it, but UVA students are often lovely people. We see the same issues, with them being nice or not nice, smart, not smart. They're just typical people. But when you are kind of indoctrinated into this us versus them mentality, you start to view all of those people through stereotypes. And so, if you're not familiar, the stereotype of a student that goes to UVA is that they're very preppy. The stereotype of a student that goes to Virginia Tech is that they're a farmer. And so this is the kind of impression that these different groups have developed for the them group in terms of us versus them. And so this can help us understand why particular groups don't get along. And the Robbers Cave study showed that if you set up a scenario where they have to do something kind of collaborative or work together, we actually see the conflict or the hostility goes down. So again, this kind of group identity can help us understand a lot of the very prolonged issues that might exist between particular social groups.